This week we'll be talking about politics, specifically looking at how people in various societies cooperate, mediate conflict, and the degree to which there's stratification of power relationships. So we're going to start from this framework of government. Does every society have a government? For anthropologists, politics isn't a simply formal state institutions. Rather, it's how people manage everyday social relationships, and this can include persuasion, force, violence, and access or control over resources. So, there, in our typology of political structures, which we'll get to in a few minutes, we recognize that anthropologically there's a difference between those populations that have formal government and those that don't. And really, the only kinds of populations that have formal, kind of sanctioned official government, full-time government officials, are those that are agricultural in either chiefdoms or states. So we'll get to all of this in a few minutes. But politics is not simply government. I mean, we do recognize, of course, that the world is filled with governmental institutions, but this isn't really how we look at it anthropologically. Some societies have a centralized political authority in the form of government, and others have what we call acephalous societies. This means societies without a head, and really, we would have spent much more of our existence as humans in acephalous societies. These are those small scale societies that are characteristic of our hunter gatherer origins. And so among foragers, we see kind of rule by group consensus. We'll look at the Kung specifically. This is the group that we watched last week in Nye's Story of a Kung Woman. The Kung did not recognize separate political spheres. Decisions were made by group consensus. This is very, very common still today among extant hunter-gatherer tribes, populations. Decisions were mediated through resources, and so food sharing was the major organizational principle. If you didn't share, you were socially ostracized, or you were even exiled or banished. And so, food sharing was a very strong collective norm where social sanctions would be used to enforce that. So Kung hunters would go to great lengths to avoid appearing arrogant. They would ridicule or kind of minimize their hunting success when they talked about it. And this helped to regulate Kung behavior without the need for laws. So think about your friend groups, right? Oftentimes, when we are deciding things with our friends, like where we're going to go for dinner or what movie we're going to see, we still operate under these group consensus types of structures. So this isn't something that's totally foreign to us. Sure, our governmental system's not based on group consensus. Perhaps it should be. Clearly, it's not. But we still have everyday social relationships, like those with our families or those with our friends, where we take everybody's opinion into consideration. So we don't really need laws to be able to operate in a friend network. Now, what's the catch? Well, it only works with low population density, right? And so, really, some of these differences that we see between types of political structure, which we'll get to in a few minutes, are mediated through population density. Group consensus works well with foraging bands because they're small, generally no more than about 50 people moving together, deciding what to do on a daily basis together. It doesn't work so well in a city of 800,000 or in a country of, a billion people. So when we look specifically at foraging bands, we see that they're egalitarian. There are some small differences in people's status. Generally, among foraging societies, you have a little higher status if you're older because you've got more knowledge to share. You might have higher status for some other kind of achieved personal characteristic, like shamanistic healing powers, or being a really good hunter, or being an expert bow maker. But these are all characteristics of the individual, not characteristics of some kind of formal political office, and we see a lot of reinforcement of social norms. Some of the things that hunter gatherers do that seem kind of foreign to us. I mean, we talked last week with reciprocity about the Ache, right? And the Ache shared really widely with their food, and to this point of where Kung men may ridicule their own hunting success, Ache men wouldn't eat from their own hunt as a way of kind of being humble about the food they were able to get for their group. So, um, really, we've got some interesting ways of mediating social norms when we look at hunter gatherer groups. When we talk about conflict, I'll bring up another anecdotal kind of piece of evidence of this. So, what we saw for most of human prehistory was informal leadership. These acephalous, headless, that's what acephalous means, or non stratified societies have informal leaders, if any at all. Elders might be looked to for guidance based on their own experience. Really, kind of that knowledge that elders possess was passed down through oral traditions, through storytelling. Storytelling was the main um, technique to pass along group level social norms to the young. There was an interesting article um, based on a book that was published several years ago that looked at the Inuit, and specifically the Inuit children don't throw temper tantrums. And so it was this question of how could there be such a big difference in parenting styles, and what was it exactly that the Inuit were doing that um, they don't really show anger. It kept both the adults and the children from having these anger, temper tantrum kind of fueled outbursts. And what it was oral traditions. It was storytelling. The elders would use stories to teach children the acceptable social norms. The elders, when there was conflict, would tell stories to mediate that conflict. And so everybody was just enculturated to using storytelling as a means of kind of regulating emotions, self soothing. And as a consequence, they didn't really get angry. Not until, of course, white people came and brought them religion and brought them alcohol specifically, did these traditions kind of change. So this elder status is an achieved status. What that means is it's based on personal characteristics. You, over the course of your life, demonstrate characteristics that people look up to or respect or value, and that is what brings you esteemed status within that population. Some cultures, such as the Batek of Malaysia, are egalitarian enough to allow for female leadership. Now, we say this is a relative rarity in a modern context, because prehistorically, evolutionarily, we would have seen relative gender equality. We would have seen males held to a slightly higher level of prestige simply because the resource that they go for is more limited in the form of hunted game. But we see respect for females. We see female-centered society where women were living among their kin networks. And when women live among kin, they automatically have greater power. So this shift to what we call the patriarchy, right? Smash the patriarchy. We live in a very patriarchal society in the U.S., even though we've got more rights of freedom for women than, let's say, fundamentalist Islamic populations that follow Sharia law. We've got a culture of misogyny. I mean, if we didn't have a culture of misogyny, people like Brock Turner wouldn't get a slap on the wrist and only 6 months in prison for verified, admitted sexual assault, right? So prehistorically, evolutionarily, we would have had relatively high female status. It's really a shift with increasing population density and the advent of warfare that brings about patriarchal societies. So it's a relative rarity today. Yes, it isn't a relative rarity in our evolutionary history. These acephalous societies are associated with small-scale foraging and horticulture, specifically associated with low population densities. As soon as our population gets too high, we have a very abrupt and rapid shift towards stratified kinds of societies. During the Enlightenment, Thomas Hobbes, who was an English philosopher, called life without former political control nasty, brutish, and short. This is part of what drove European imperialism, was the idea that there needed to be a monarch, the crown, to lead people. And it was thusly European destiny to go forth from Europe and civilize these savage, nasty, brutish populations. And John Locke also argued for the necessity of a social contract and rule of law, that these are still central tenets in many societies. And so these were often also tied into religious indoctrination and the idea that the only way people could be moral, upstanding, law abiding citizens was if they had knowledge of and believed in some kind of formal deity. And so, as we look at this movement to bring quote unquote civilization to indigenous populations the world over during the colonial period, one of the things that was stressed was bringing them religion in the form oftentimes of Christianity, though there have been other societies that have done this through both Hinduism and Islam, Zoroastrianism, etc. Really, this drive was to bring them into a population or a civilization with law-abiding citizens. So politics was deeply tied to colonialism. A negative consequence of exploration outside of Europe was the assumption that similar forms of government as those in Europe should be forced on the peoples of Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Pacific via colonialism. So we've got a picture here of E. Evans Pritchard, surrounded by the people that he's brought under kind of the umbrella of European rule. Colonial governance was quote unquote burdened with bringing government and politics and the rule of law to these colonial situations. This also, though, gave anthropologists unique opportunities to study how there's maintenance of order in societies without formal governments and political leaders. We messed it up, though. Europeans messed up the world. That shouldn't really be surprising. We're in a time that we're trying to reverse the trend of whitewashing history, but a lot of the unrest that we find in continents like Africa is a result of kind of the after effects of colonialism. One of the things that colonial governments did was reassign people's ethnicity, basically. And so they would move populations around. They would just consider everyone equal in terms of the same ethnicity, or come up with arbitrary ethnicity markers. One of the famous examples of this, if you guys have seen the film Hotel Rwanda, and actually you guys may do this for extra credit, you may watch Hotel Rwanda and write a 500-word reflection with 2/3 summarizing the film and 1/3 including your personal reflections. But looking at the after effects of this colonial empire building. In Rwanda, there was a distinction between the Hutus and the Tutsis. These groups weren't distinguished or different prior to colonialism. What the colonial leaders did was set an arbitrary kind of cutoff where if you had more than 11 cows, you were considered one ethnic group. If you had fewer than 11 cows, you were considered the other. And so it was colonialism and artificially designating a difference between these two ethnic populations that weren't distinct populations or ethnicities beforehand, that created the civil war that led to the genocide in Rwanda. So, European colonialism really kind of messed up indigenous populations the world over. All right, so colonial studies produced the anthropological theory of what we call structural functionalism. And so within cultural anthropology, you look at government in the forms of how various governmental structures inherently function. And so the idea of bringing in kind of an all-powerful leader, a monarch who governs then through nested hierarchies of colonial governors and then local leaders under colonial government leadership, etc. Um, so among these acephalous societies, one of the biggest drivers of identity and social relationships was kinship. Okay, in hunter-gatherer societies, women live surrounded by their kin, and this created kind of that. You guys have heard the phrase, "It takes a village to raise a child," right? Well, this was the village. It was females and their female kin, so networks of mothers, grandmothers, aunties, etc., who all played a pivotal role in enculturation of children and reinforcing those social obligations. In formal kind of state level sociopolitical systems, kinship ties are erased, and that's one of the really effective methods um, at quelling kind of revolting. So, uh, kinship ties were one of the predominant ways in which society life, social relationships were organized. Among pastoral societies, so for example, the Maasai of Kenya and Tanzania, we saw something kind of above and beyond that. We found age grades and what we call sodalities. So we'll talk about the Maasai just for a minute, because when you watched the film Maasai Women, you noticed that phenomenon of moronhood, right? You noticed that the boys were inducted into the moron, which were what we would call an age grade sodality. You were inducted into moronhood when you were kind of on the cusp or starting to go through puberty. So generally between about the ages of 15 or 18, males would be circumcised and inducted into moronhood. They weren't allowed to live in the village. They lived on the outskirts of the community. They had to tend their own herds. They had to do their own milking. They historically fulfilled roles of warriors. These were the fighters kind of on the outside of society that would keep their villages from being raided. So a very valuable kind of social function. But it also, there's a part of me, I've got a young teen boy at home. Well, I don't know if he's young teen anymore. He's about to turn 15, and it just kind of cracks me up because sometimes I fantasize about sending him off on the outskirts of society to live without having to have constant contact, just because of the sullenness and how the world's always unfair. But no offense to, I know we've got a student in this class who's also only 15. But, when you work with teenagers, you realize they kind of think in a different way. They operate in a different way. And, they're very peer focused. So there's something to be said for having peer groups that are kind of able to function on their own. Anyway, so the Moran are responsible. They used to be warriors. Now the Kenyan state government, national government, doesn't really like warfare, so it's more of a ceremonial function. But it defines their identity, and they stay Moran until they're in their late 20s, early 30s, at which they go through Enuoto after that insult ceremony. Then they come together and their heads are shaved and their faces painted and they're sprayed with milk, and they emerge out of that ceremony as elders. So very distinct identities, very distinct cultural milestones that help these young men to define their place in society. I mean, really, if you look at American society, we're missing a lot of that. We don't have these clearly defined rites of passage that let people know what their rights and responsibilities are. And so, we tell people, well, you're an adult at the age of 18. Okay, great. You're an adult. You can go fight and die for your country. You have to pay taxes, all that jazz, but you still can't drink, right? Or you still can't rent a car, or, all of these other things. So, anyway, that's just a little soapbox that I really, truly, honestly, and even teaching teenagers, that reinforces it. I feel like we do a disservice to our teens, to our adolescents, because we're not giving them clearly defined social roles. But anyway, these age grades. These sodalities help to reinforce identity and rules that have to be followed. You guys saw in that insult ceremony that during this transitional phase, the rules are kind of upended and thrown on their heads, right? And you have the mothers come for the insult ceremony where they have to drink that rendered fat and then make body accusations of incest and bestiality and such. And so you guys didn't get the benefit of the subtitles because in Maasai women they don't have the transcript basically of what the mothers and sons are saying to each other, but there's a companion film, Maasai Men, that does, and it's it's allegations of like you're so fat that you waddle like a water buffalo, or your father is anyway, just allegations of incestuous and bestial relationships. So those conventions are kind of thrown on their head during this transition phase, and then once these young men go through Inuoto, they know exactly what their place in society is. They have rights of ownership over cattle. They have rights of marriage. They have paternity of any offspring that their wives produce, etc. Religious ritual can also serve to reinforce political power and help maintain solidarity within groups and unity against other groups, and can help resolve local disputes. I mean, think about the history of Catholicism, right? During kind of this empire building, much of Europe and the Eurasian steppes were under the rule of the Holy Roman Emperor, right? So these early states, particularly early despotic states where you've got supreme rule, these were intimately tied to religion. Religious deities were used kind of as a justification for rule. And so think about the Egyptian pharaohs, right? They were either hosting gods or were gods themselves incarnate. This is also true for the Aztec, the Inca, the Maya during the height of Mayan civilization. This is true of monarchs among medieval Europe. We've got this tie-in of the lamas from Tibetan society. We've got this tie-in of religious leadership with political leadership. And think of how religion is used. Religion is used in a variety of ways, but some of its functions include maintaining social solidarity. Think about the strength of congregation, right? This certainly contributes to religious effervescence, but it's also then used to maintain social control. What better way of ensuring compliance than having an omniscient deity that's watching every move that you make, right? That the God or God is always watching you. God sees everything you do. God sees even in your thoughts. And that notion of like Catholic shame and guilt when you do something that God wouldn't approve of. And then identifying us versus them, feeling solidarity with people who subscribe to the same religion that you subscribe to, and feeling opposition to those that are somehow different. So throughout sub-Saharan Africa, for example, people who don't adhere to cultural norms are liable to be accused of witchcraft or sorcery and thusly punished. We have a history of witchcraft allegations in the U.S. as well. There were witchcraft allegations in Europe. A lot of those allegations were leveled against herbalists and healers and traditional midwives. There is a part of the history of midwifery is fielding these allegations of witchcraft, and it was a tool really of these patriarchal social organizations to undermine the solidarity and kind of aid and service and healing that female institutions were able to contribute. So you violate social norms, you don't adhere to Christianity, you don't adhere to the patriarchy, you maybe aren't married by the time you're 16. Artificial rules of society, and when you violate those, you're branded a witch. The structural functionalists in anthropology argue that this belief in witchcraft and the fear that it provoked operated as a rudimentary criminal justice system, all without formal laws. So even in these acephalous informal governmental populations, these allegations of witchcraft serve to have social